Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and thank you for joining us on this early Saturday morning for a session on a Green New Deal for Southeast Asia in the post-COVID-19 era. As I think rather aptly, there is a question mark at the end of the title as we explore this morning with our panelists whether Green New Deal is feasible to be catalyzed in this region as we recover from the devastating COVID-19 impact. My name is Alizan Mahadi. I'm a Director of Research at ISIS Malaysia and I will be the moderator for this session today. With me, we are very honored to have a very esteemed and eminent panel, as well as a diverse panel as well, consisting of Mr. Desmond Tan, Minister of State, the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment of Singapore. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Minister.
Thank you.
Dr. Christoph Nedapurwan, Director of the Green Belt and Road Initiative Center at the International Institute of Green Finance. Welcome, Dr. Christoph.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
We also have Ms. Ana May Yulamantio, Chairperson of Bill Committee, Department of Public Works and Highways of the Philippines. I understand she's joining us while also distributing vaccines. Thank you, Ms. Ana, for joining us in your busy schedule.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Ashley Johnson, Director of Energy and Environmental Affairs at the Asian National Bureau of Asian Research. Welcome, Ms. Ashley.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, this session will run until 9:20 a.m. with around 15 minutes of interactive panel discussions, followed by the 25 minutes of Q&A. You can post and upvote your questions on Slido. So for those asking questions, I would like you to request you to please write the questions down clearly and also identify to whom are the questions directed to, and also just to bear in mind that the questions, although the event is streamed, live streamed across various platforms, the Slido is the only platform that we are receiving the questions. So before we started, we asked a poll on what is the one green initiative that you would like to see implemented in your country. And we've got a few answers here. Fun enough, the largest one seems to be Asian Elon Musk. So that is I don't know how we can implement that, but we also have sustainable energy, sustainable farming, solar, and a few various other responses. So I think hopefully we can touch upon a few of them today. So ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about a Green New Deal, of course it evokes President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, a broad-based reform that helped the US recover from the Great Depression. Essentially, it addresses major issues, such as in the case of the New Deal, a focus on infrastructure in an effort to reset the economy. So Green New Deal is therefore meant to move away from more largely piecemeal efforts to address sustainability to a more integrated and holistic manner. So we have recently seen moves towards this, such as the European Green Deal, President Joe Biden's $2 trillion climate plan, and so on. So the question we will explore today is whether a Green New Deal for the Southeast Asia is feasible in the post-COVID-19 era. We will begin the session by very broadly exploring the challenges first. When we talk about a Green New Deal and more generally aiming for sustainable development, I think we have spoken about this for a number of years. You know, from 1992, we had the Sustainable Development Process at the United Nations. Now we have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the Paris Agreement, and various other multilateral environmental agreements as well. But yet, we still hear that we are not on track to address the climate crisis, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. And we are still overshooting the Earth's carrying capacity and our consumption of natural resources. We are still headed towards an extinction crisis if we don't resolve the biodiversity crisis. So, on that note, on that scary note, on a Saturday morning, we will begin with you, Mr. Minister Desmond Tan. Desmond, what are the major challenges currently, in your view, hindering sustainable development around the world? Desmond?
Desmond, you're muted.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I was still getting used to this new normal. So thank you for having me. As I was just saying that it is indeed a very early Saturday morning. I'm very impressed with our dedication to sustainability, to wake up so early and to maximize the daylight hours that we have to discuss a very important topic. So when he talks about sustainable development, actually it covers a very wide range of issues, right? From development to education to climate change and so on. And I think that we all know that when we talk about sustainable development, it has to do with consumption, the rate of consumption of the natural resources that we have on the earth. So my personal view, one of the biggest challenge that mankind is going to face going forward that probably affects our consumption versus the natural production from the natural resources has to do with climate change, right? Which is, I think, the central discussion topic of many people these days and many academics, and it's a concern of not just our generation. Actually, it's a concern across various generations. I think when we grow up, we talk about sustainability, not quite in the same way that we talk about today, but it is no less important, growing up in our times. And young people today in particular talks about sustainable development a little bit more, maybe from a different perspective. Our time, I think we talk about economic sustainability. How do we make sure that we survive as a community, as a society, as a country? Maybe once we become more developed, naturally young people talks about something more ideological, something even more. Talk about carbon emission, they talk about single-use plastics. I think these are all important issues that has to be dealt with, because whatever we do in this generation at this time has a real impact on the future generation. And we cannot continue to consume at the rate that we have today, because that the depletion of natural resources is a real threat. So coupled with, I think that climate change that led to many natural disasters with drought and fires and all that is a real hindrance to sustainable development. And the other one, of course, right now we are facing a pandemic. So this in itself, unexpected, unpredictable, will be a threat as well to sustainable development. I'll just stop here so that my fellow colleagues can talk about it.
Thank you, Desmond. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, sustainability is not merely an environmental issue. I think you linked it from consumption patterns and production, our economic system, and so on. And this is where the narrative has been coming more and more recently, that it's not merely an environmental issue and it affects development. Can I call now Ms. Anna Mayuk? Can you provide your views on the challenges, perhaps from a practical perspective, as I understand you are undertaking various efforts to be working on the ground to address many of these development issues? Anna?
When we started with the build, we realized that in Manila, a sizable number of trips could actually be made by foot and bicycle, because of the average distance traveled per trip is actually very low. And this was also confirmed by a parallel study by Asian Development Bank. So we found out that nearly 35% of the destinations are within a 15-minute walk or a bicycle trip, but the majority of the short trips are actually made by paratransit, by jeepneys and tricycles and cars. And this was based on a Metro Manila urban transport integration study. Now in the Philippines, bicycle lanes are now mandatory as early as the planning stages, and we've just released this memorandum a couple of months ago by our Public Works Secretary, Mark Villar. With the issuance of Department Order 88, all projects that involve new road and bridge construction shall include in its design the provision of bicycle facilities, if feasible. We have implemented 3 classes of bicycles. We have shared use bike path, we have separated bike path, and we have shared roadways. And I guess one of the major challenges is the change in mindset for people to actually embrace and adopt this policy change, because people are so used with driving cars that there will always be a debate on who deserves a road more. But if we look at the statistics, there are more pedestrians and there are more cyclists than there are car owners. And so we believe that this is the right strategy as far as traffic and sustainable development is concerned. And We have been implementing it now. We are implementing a mask. I mean, if you've been into the Philippines, I'm sure you know how bad the traffic is. And now we're undertaking the EDSA decongestion program. This will also have a lot of pedestrian facilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And there we can see the massive scale of the changes required from both infrastructure but also lifestyle change point of view. That is a challenge that you've highlighted. Now I'll seek some views from Ashley to address the same questions. What are the challenges hindering sustainability? Maybe from perhaps a energy transition point of view, or what or your view?
Definitely, thank you. I think one of the leading challenges we face as we work to develop in a sustainable manner is what is defined as sustainable. And I think that is a question as you're at different stages of development that changes. In the US, of course, right now in a lot of more advanced economies, they're trying to eliminate all carbon emissions by 2050, depending on some of the different plans. There's different timelines for that. But then as you look to achieve energy access and sustainable growth, where do fuels like natural gas fit into that question? Where some that might not be a sustainable solution, whereas in other situations that might be a better solution to other alternatives like coal. There's also questions about mining, about hydropower. Is that considered in some cases sustainable? That is a conversation I think we could continue to have, but I think that is one challenge that we face in these conversations of what is sustainable for one country might have a different definition somewhere else. Another one that I want to build off that Anna had hit on is that changing mindsets and building skill sets. We can only get so far if the human capacity level and our own capabilities can match the goals that we've set. So there is a longer term challenge and opportunity that we face of making sure that our workforces, that our youth are ready for what might be coming in the pipeline in the future, and making sure that they have as many opportunities and knowledges and skill sets that they can to adapt to what might be coming to become the next Elon Musk, if that is the goals that people might have, and to identify what new technologies might help achieve sustainable development. The last one I'll hit on is mobilizing finance, which I know we'll talk about more in the COVID conversation, because that does pose a challenge of how do you achieve a sustainable development plan if you're also balancing maybe on the energy side with other concerns for social welfare, public health, other economic development plans, which are all equally important. So it's kind of balancing those things and finding the financing to achieve your energy goals that align with some of those other challenges as well. So pretty high level on each of those, but I know we'll probably dive into some of them later in this conversation.
Thank you, Ashley. And I think you brought up, goes to segue into my question to Dr. Christoph as well regarding challenges. I think, Dr. Christoph, you have been dealing with the finance perspective in terms of the green finance. So maybe Dr. Christoph, your views on challenges, perhaps you want to focus on a bit more, delve a bit in detail with the finance question as well. Dr. Christoph?
Yeah, thank you. I'm also very much enjoying listening to all our fellow panelists, because I think they bring up extremely valuable points. And the last point by Ashley about the finances, of course, is something that hits my nerves. So we are working here in Beijing on establishing sustainable and green financial systems, and working across the board in China and abroad. And two very relevant projects that I was involved in. I was the lead author for the SDG finance taxonomy of the UNDP last year, and of the Green Development Guidance that was backed by relevant Chinese ministries for Chinese overseas investments. And kind of in both of them, we looked at the challenges that were also just brought up. What is actually sustainable development? What is actually green development? What focus areas do we have? Because of course, as everybody said, we want to have some form of economic development. And when we listen to the audience, that there is the need for like an ASEAN Elon Musk to really drive this future of mobility or any other sector, there's kind of this dream of kind of making things happen, using innovation to go to the new green green times. But at the same time, kind of what is not sustainability? I think this is often the question that we should also ask ourselves. So what we did in both the SDG finance taxonomy and the green finance taxonomy, more or less, for Chinese overseas investments, is to be very clear: what does it mean to do significant harm? And kind of the first thing that we have to do is to do significant harm to people, and of course, particularly since we talk about the green development agenda, to the environment. And the environment, of course, kind of, we really separated this also from a financial perspective into three aspects. It's the climate, that's biodiversity, that's also pollution. And this is something often we forget, particularly coming from China, where air pollution, soil pollution, water pollution are a major issue. So that's not only about biological diversity, but then that impacts directly, kind of this pollution aspect directly impacts the health. So everything is in many ways extremely interlinked. And for the financial sector, what's really interesting is kind of how do we measure the risks that come from non-sustainable development, non-green development, and how do we measure actually and pay for the benefits that we have. And this is really kind of where the whole financial sector can play such an important role, from the financial institutions that have to invest in it, to the Ministry of Finance that kind of often then provides government support through blended finance, kind of actually mobilizing also kind of public finance, to then the central banks that allow financial institutions, or that push financial institutions to include sustainability risks, so for example climate risks, but also then allow financial institutions to finance themselves, for example, more cheaply when they have green bonds or any type of green credits on their balance sheet. So kind of this whole system is extremely complicated in order to mobilize the finance for sustainable development. First of all, we have to understand sustainable development.
Thank you, Dr. Christoph. And I think you and Ashley as well highlighted the complexity of sustainable development. We are still defining it. When we go to practical terms, practical solutions, we need better definitions, taxonomies, etc. So in some ways, I think there's some optimism there. We are moving towards more sophisticated ways of addressing this, but still we are at that stage of still defining and understanding the complexity, the interlinkages, etc. you mentioned of sustainability. Now, I know, Anna, you have to go since you have to distribute the vaccines soon. So let me just follow on from that, looking more into, we spoke about the challenges, but really looking into the solutions moving forward before you go. What are the solutions, both that you're currently undertaking, but that you feel we should focus on moving forward? Anna?
There are, I believe that the change will start on the policy level, that once the government embraces sustainable development as a policy, then it becomes part of the norm. And in the Philippines, we've been trying to push that direction by now institutionalizing bicycle lanes, which at one point was never heard of in the Philippines. It was only in recent years that we had a bicycle lane. And if you go to Boston, for example, and if you go to the United States, if you go to Denmark, there are a lot of bicycle lanes. And in the Philippines, it was fairly recent. It was only 3 years ago that we established our first segregated bicycle lane. So I think this move is very important for us, and to have it at the policy level and have it incorporated as early as the planning stages, I think will actually introduce more green infrastructure in the long term. And I agree with everyone. Financing is a very important tool, and I'm actually very happy that multilateral institutions are very supportive of the move to transition to more pedestrian infrastructure, for instance. And we have been collaborating with ADB and with World Bank, with JICA, in ensuring that, for example, flood control projects are also used as walkways and as bicycle lanes. So now you have a multifunctional infrastructure project that serves as a flood control component and as a pedestrian infrastructure. Again, I'm really sorry we have to go, but it was really nice meeting you, and I look forward to seeing you all again, maybe post-pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you for what you're doing.
All the best, Anna. Take care.
All the best.
Take
Thank you
care.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna, for joining us despite your busy time and your contribution in this COVID-19 pandemic. Staying on the same, we've heard from the experience in Philippines. Maybe Desmond, would you like to share a bit on the key mitigating actions in Singapore, as well as the potential solutions moving forward? Desmond?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start off at the macro level. I think when you talk about solution to sustainable development, of course, it's a very, very wide topic. But I think it all starts with a strong political will, right, for any country. You need to understand the severity and to declare that this is really something important. So in Singapore, we have recently kind of announced that we declare this as a global crisis, and it requires the efforts of not just one country, right? So the other important factors about the solutioning is about collaboration. So it is, like the pandemic, we can't solve this problem alone. It requires a whole of the world kind of efforts, everybody chipping in. Of course, in particular for this region, in ASEAN, the countries around this region, we have to work together to make sure that we come up with solutions together to solve the many problems that the climate presents to us. So I would say that these two, political will and collaboration, are important factors to allow us to solve the multi-generational problem. One sort of strategy, I think one enabler that will help us be more sustainable going forward in our development is, of course, technology and innovation. Right? So that's been talked about by Ashley as well as Christoph. And I think that this, in many ways, allows us to think about the problem from a different perspective. We have been looking at consumption, and I go back to my earlier definition of sustainable development, going back to consumption, with population growth, increase in economic activities, urbanization. These are all factors that affect our consumption. And if you look at it, traditionally we look at consumption in a very linear pattern, right? You take from the natural resources, you consume it, you dispose of it, either you incinerate or you dispose of it in other ways. So I think that's a very linear way. But going forward, if you want sustainable development, especially when it comes to consumption, we have to think of a more circular economy. We have to look at how we can recycle and close the loop, whether it's in the form of the water, or it's in food, or it's in waste, right? So agriculture as well, we have to close the loop. So of course, in Singapore, we have closed the water loop. So every drop of water that we collect, we drink, we dispose, they are recycled back with our new water plant. So I think that's one way to keep us sustainable going into the future. We are right now looking at food and waste circularity. How can we actually, import our food, consume it, they become waste, and how can this waste be recycled for other users? So I think that's one. Maybe I can cite an example. You know that in Singapore we incinerate all our waste, plastics and all papers and all that. And there is a few incineration plants, and they are all then moved to an island just off the southern part of Singapore, called Semakau Island. We call it the Semakau landfill because the incinerated waste will then be filled up. And now we are looking at how we can reuse these waste, which are basically ashes, to become building material, for example. So if we are successful in that, actually there will be some kind of circularity, because otherwise, even if we incinerate, actually the landfill will run out of space in 2035. So we have to look at that aspect. In food production as well, given that we import more than 90% of our food in Singapore, I think we're looking at how can we use technology and innovation to allow us to better use the products from the food as well as the waste from the food. So just to give you a quick example, the poultry, we have our chicken farm, eggs farm, and the poultry waste actually can be reused as biogas, and they can power the plant, the farm itself. And then the solid waste of the poultry can actually be used for fertilizers for vegetables. I think these are some of the circular principles that we try to implement with the help of technology. And I think that will really help us in our development going forward.
Thank you, Desmond, and thank you for bringing up circular economy, which is really getting traction, which we will speak a bit later, especially this post-COVID-19 era where we have, well, during COVID, I think we're still during COVID times now, we have shortening supply chains, etc. So this idea of circular economy as well is gaining traction, I believe, during this time. Now I'll go to Dr. Christoph, sticking to the solutions. You've already mentioned a few of the kind of focus on how to bring in the taxonomies, etc., in terms of the finance. But generally speaking, do you feel that these solutions will be possible during this time, Dr. Christoph?
Yeah, so kind of I want to add something to what I said before and what kind of all the previous speakers have said before. First of all, I think we have because you said we don't know what necessarily sustainability is. I think we know a lot what sustainability is. So rather than kind of finding the perfect solution that we will never find because it's such a evolving topic, we have to start now with what we know. And I think we know a lot about sustainability already in terms of kind of energy use, in terms of transport, which was mentioned before, in terms of circular economy. So we know a lot. So there's no more excuse to stop, to start now. So every day counts, and every day we wait longer, the harder and more expensive it gets. So I think that's where we are, and that's where we have been actually, to be honest, for decades. And so we should never continue the path of perfect definition in order to find in the future sometimes a great solution. So start now. It's extremely important. The earlier we start, the better. And really kind of the second thing is we have to focus. What is the most pressing issue? And I think also there we have so much data already to understand from a climate perspective and from a biodiversity perspective, where they are the most kind of where we have to shift financial flows, where we have to shift investments. And it's clear kind of the three areas I think that are most pressing in terms of the environment is energy, transport, and agriculture. And I think all three topics have been mentioned. And kind of the energy system, I think there it's very clear we have alternatives. So how can we accelerate investments in these alternatives? So solar and wind particularly, and how can we immediately phase out coal-fired power plants? Now, of course, coal-fired power plants always is like we have potential investments, we have potential work, but in the end, it's much more expensive to invest in coal, not only for the investors in terms of the levelized cost of energy, but also, of course, as an overall economy, if we include the cost of climate change. So here's a very clear alternative. Transport, I think, kind of the investments from a solution perspective, our esteemed colleague Anna just mentioned, I think, kind of the bicycle lanes and non-motorized transportation. That's, of course, nice for urban transport, but in the transport area, I think we are struggling most currently with actual solutions. So, of course, we think electric cars are kind of a solution for climate. Electric cars come still with energy need, and as long as the energy system is not green, we still pollute a lot in the climate aspect, and much more also on the biodiversity aspect, because the batteries, both in the production and the recycling, are extremely challenging for the environment. And really, the third sector, that's something that we often kind of dismiss, is agriculture. And I think kind of Desmond just mentioned also kind of the question of circular economy and how can we become better. I think we have to really address a shift in our behavior and our also belief that meat is such an essential part of our diets. Meat is just extremely bad for climate and for biodiversity. So how can we invest, and here really technological solutions, for example, in alternatives meats, and really accelerate this, bring this into our daily lives much more than currently our meat consumption. So really kind of this is driven by politics, this is driven by behavior changes that comes bottom up, and of course, ideally implemented in collaboration internationally, where investors can come from anywhere, where technology can come from everywhere, but of course the implementation needs to be happening on the ground.
Thank you, Christoph. And I think you've highlighted a few focus areas the potential focus areas that we should look into. For example, energy, transport, agriculture, and also circular economy was brought up by Desmond earlier. Ashley, would you like to chip in here in terms of your thoughts in terms of which are the focus areas that we can do?
Yes. So as we look at some of the energy mix question, energy transitions as countries assess how to set their own energy mix based on the goals that they've set, the resources that they have, and the capabilities that they're working towards. I think one of the key areas for a solution is through trade. And I know specifically this is an area that Southeast Asia has been working on, is the cross-country, cross-border electricity trade, and being able to utilize the resources, the electricity that's generated through renewable energy to help offset loads or to cover loads during peak or non-peak times. Now, there's of course that question still I know about batteries and storage and how you can reduce lost electricity as you do transmit it. And I think that's another area that we have a lot of potential is in that collaboration. So I'd like to echo Desmond's comments about collaboration and political will. And I think something that there's a lot of excitement about in the US right now is kind of a return to our commitments to building a sustainable future. I know there's a lot to make up that we've kind of excluded ourselves from in the past several years, but I know there's also then been a lot of effort at the state level and at a private sector level, companies that are working to help achieve some of these goals that maybe at a national level we haven't been working towards. But there is, I think, now that revitalized sense here to really put kind of where our goals are and try to work towards those, and specifically focusing on how can we help strengthen some of those technology collaborations? Where can we partner to help find that next development in battery technology and renewable energy technology that can help, again, bridge some of those questions that might facilitate trade, that would help trade, or in just generation in maybe less accessible areas. I know there's always the conversation of how do you get power to island communities sometimes, or in places like Nepal and some intense mountainous areas that are hard to access. So there's a lot of questions, I think, that there might be a revitalized political will from the US to kind of help put money where our mouths are as we move forward, which I think is really important. I'll leave it there, I think.
Thank you, Ashley. I think you've brought in another component to the discussion today, which is trade. I think from the session today, we've already seen how sustainability really goes beyond, as I mentioned earlier, the environment, but incorporates trade, consumption patterns, and so on. So this is really a tough challenge, a systemic challenge that we are facing in the world. And that leads into my next set of questions, which really turns to now. So now we, of course, around the world, we are facing the COVID-19 pandemic. In one way, the COVID-19 provides a good opportunity to build back better through the various economic stimulus packages, public investments, and low interest rates, and so on. But on the other hand, the low price of fossil fuels also means that in a time of economic crisis, perhaps it's the cheapest way to recover and revert back to status quo. So the question is, what are the trade-offs that must be considered, and will this either prioritize or deprioritize sustainability issues moving forward as we recover from this COVID-19 pandemic? Desmond, do you have any views on this?
Yeah, sure. I think first, I think let's talk about the current situation, COVID, right? So I think that while for a while we all kind of celebrated that there was a respite for the environment, with COVID, there's a lot less carbon emission. I think some data showed a 6.4% drop in the global carbon emission last year, which is a good thing for the environment. There is a reset, but we know that it's short-lived, right? So the economic activities has resumed. Traveling has slowly going to be resumed. But what is becoming more prevalent is also the consumption of plastics, with all these takeaways and all that. So that has in other ways created another demand on the environment. So these are the challenges. You talk about trade-off, I think it's very real for especially smaller countries like Singapore, given we have very little alternative energy. We have very little carbon sinks in terms of our countryside. We are a city-state, right? Much like DC or even in Beijing. So for us, managing trade-off is actually at the center of everything we do for sustainable development. Because as much as we would like to preserve all the greeneries, we would like to, slow down our economic development, but our people need to have jobs. We need to make sure that the businesses are continue, especially during this crisis. So I think one of the challenges that I see with COVID coming in is that government and countries may start prioritizing economic development, because this is not just a health crisis, right? It is also an economic crisis. So how do we ensure that the countries and economy bounce back? So investment in green growth, investment in green businesses, some of these parts may actually take a back seat as a result of COVID, because everybody is trying to bring back the economy. So that's my main concern. But of course, like I mentioned, in Singapore, we have recently announced the Green Plan, which has a large part on the green economy as well. And that's something we all have to deal with. But going back to trade-off, I would like to maybe give an illustration, that if you look at how, when we talk about trade-off, it's always about economy and environment. It's almost a zero-sum game. It's like you talk about, let's grow first before we talk about greening. Right, that's how we talk about in the past, because it's about survival, right? It's about building the country, the city. So it's almost like green after you grow. So let's talk about growing first, and then we see how to green ourselves. But I think increasingly we realize that actually it's better to prevent than to try and solve the problem. So it becomes, let's green while we grow. Right? So that's a mindset shift, and you can see the balance and trade-off going towards greening. But I think going forward, it's not just about green before you grow or green as you grow. It's green in order to grow. I think that's the kind of mindset we want to have for businesses and economy, that actually the environment is a very important part of our businesses, that sustainability as an agenda is important, not just for young people, but for all of us, because this is the way for us to build our economy, to build our country in order for us to sustain going forward, for mankind to continue to sustain into the next generation. So these are some of my thoughts I'll share. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Desmond. And just perhaps during the crisis where we had, blue skies, cleaner rivers, etc. And we spoke about behavior change, lifestyle changes before. Perhaps that sort of consciousness may have occurred during the pandemic crisis as one of the better outcomes of a devastating pandemic impact. But I guess we will see moving forward. Ashley, would you like to also comment here on the impact of COVID-19, perhaps to the energy transition, especially within the Southeast Asian region? How do you see it?
So last summer, when we were all still pretty early last summer, optimistic that maybe this would be a relatively short term, or maybe that was just us here in DC that had that perspective. We were looking at this as a potential opportunity, that we're seeing massive disruption. We were already feeling the economic costs, but from an energy perspective, because people were going out less, there was a massive disruption in oil and gas demand, that maybe this would shake up business as usual enough to kind of spark action on green investment, green growth, whatever it might have been for different plans. That wasn't what we ended up seeing, because as it continued to progress, again, there were other priorities that we had to focus on, both here in the US and across the world, to make sure that we had medical supplies and job retention programs, welfare programs. So there was, I think, in the energy space, in some ways, kind of a lost opportunity, as we were trying to maybe use this as a catalyst to really just springboard into the clean energy transition. That being said, I think this has also put a lot of, as Desmond highlighted, as we look at the environmental benefits of people seeing blue skies, there still has been that kind of, let's keep some of that going. We've already reverted back. Unfortunately, I know we're seeing pretty similar CO2 emission levels as before the pandemic, but there was that kind of trade-off of how can we maybe use the negative aspect of this to achieve something better. I think here in the US in particular, we didn't do well on that. That was something that we did not seize, but maybe there'll be something that comes out of this as we continue with a new green plan here in the US and a new climate strategy and green jobs. But that's, I think, still remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you, Ashley, for that review. Maybe Dr. Christoph, you being part of the BRI or studying closely the BRI as well, what are your views? Is this an opportunity that has been, utilized in a way as there's been changes in terms of, progressing towards a more green development? Your views, Dr. Christoph?
Yeah, thanks. I fully agree with what the two previous speakers that Ashley and Desmond said. Couldn't agree more. I think the two focus areas are very clear. We want to create jobs. We want to ensure that with this some form of recovery, we want to create jobs. The second priority is how do we manage public debt? We're seeing all around the world, and including in some of the ASEAN countries, a huge amount of public debt that becomes increasingly unserviceable. And it's not only, of course, in developing countries, but also increasingly, of course, in developed countries. So this is a huge challenge for any government that wants to pursue long-term debt sustainability, long-term growth, just because, of course, the GDP in most countries actually contracted. So we are seeing this double pressing. It's we need to create jobs. Ideally, we do that through government support, but at the same time, we have this huge public debt. Now, the question that's anywhere, what are some of the solutions? Clearly, private money is not the solution. What we've seen is a little bit almost insane, that a lot of the prices for example, real estate and of course also in the stock markets have risen despite huge challenges in the broader economies. So private money, and we know that also because we have flooded the money markets, is really not a problem. The question is how can we shift that money, both in terms of green development, but also shifting it from the developed world into the developing world. In the developed world, where you often get very low returns on some of your assets, into the developing world, where ideally you get much higher returns. So there's a lot of money flowing around, particularly private money, where that we should use. Now, but how? So the easy solution is often, let's particularly for investors, let's do what we have been doing all the time. And that's interestingly also for governments. It's always we're falling back into the same trap. It's all right, we need to create jobs. Let's create the good old infrastructure. Let's create some good old coal-fired power plants, because we know how they work. We know how to calculate them. We know how many jobs we have. And all these new technologies are extremely difficult to calculate the returns over the long term. How do we finance them? What does it actually mean? What are the risks? And of course, this is what investors care about. And this is also in some ways what governments care about, because they want to have very visible projects that where people are working hard with their hard heads, ideally. So we see all the this development. We also see that, unfortunately, in China, where we see too much of the old infrastructure development. And despite, of course, China being one of the largest investors in renewable energy, China is also by far the largest investor in coal-fired power plants. And also domestically, its coal-fired energy has increased much more last year than actually its renewable energy. So we always have to see that this old development path, unfortunately, exists in too many countries. We see, though, that some countries, for example, Vietnam, Pakistan have announced a much more aggressive, for example, phase out of coal. Also, Bangladesh has just again negotiated with the Chinese to stop investing in coal-fired power plants because of the risk of this becoming stranded assets and not really lucrative for the investors. So what are the green solutions that should be invested in? Kind of, as we said, green energy is so obvious. Green infrastructure, that means public transportation, that means railroad systems, and that creates a lot of jobs, but ideally kind of sets the path to the future. And what's really, really important is education and trainings. We have to shift a lot of the employees from kind of the old sectors into the new sectors. There's so much opportunities that we should use, particularly that the public money is now being spent anyway, kind of really use it as well for training for new types of jobs. So I think we're seeing some of that, but we're seeing, in fact, far too little from that. There's great studies about kind of how governments are using the COVID stimulus for green growth, and most countries are actually not doing so well. I think some of the countries, particularly in Europe, are doing better, and they're also facing, of course, with joblessness and green recovery. So I'll end here. I could go on otherwise.
Thank you, Dr. Christoph, and that, again, it's a good segue into our next question, and I'll stick with you on this regarding more specific policy interventions. You brought up issues such as capacity building, etc. So now we have to, as you say, we have to focus, we have to prioritize as well. So in your view, what should be the policy interventions that should be pursued moving forward by national governments within the ASEAN region to promote sustainable development at this point? Dr. Christoph.
Yeah, I think that's kind of, in some ways, of course, a complex question, but in some ways also an easy. There are easier solutions. So as Desmond also said, kind of policy matters. And also Anna said it, and also Ashley said it. Policy matters. If you set the right policies to say we have to always include bicycle lanes, that we prioritize public transport over private transport, that we prioritize clean energy by setting a carbon price, for example, over brown energy. These are clear, policy-driven, legally driven signals that also steer investment. The second thing is, how can we accelerate blended finance? Because particularly in some of the newer technologies where investors sometimes are a little bit hesitant to invest because they don't know the risk-return profile of these investments, how can we ensure through blended finance, that means kind of blending public finance and private finance, blending the finance from multilateral development banks, which are, of course, very active in the ASEAN region. How can we blend debt finance, which is often cheaper, with private finance? So really kind of trying to use the toolboxes that we have and have applied over the last decades much more rigorously, with a clear goal of green development and job creation. So again, policy signals, blended finance, mobilizing private finance through that, and also getting more finance from the private developed countries, private investors in developed countries should be the priority, and that can be through opening capital markets, which is I think ASEAN is actually quite good. China is working on it always to open capital markets to attract more foreign investors.
Ashley, your views on the policy interventions that we should prioritize at this moment in time?
I'd like to jump on the capacity building point that Christoph made. I think that is one of the areas with most to gain from as we look at long-term growth and outcomes. I know there's many initiatives that already exist and that aim to do a few separate things. One, helping to bring science into the policy conversation. What is possible? And I know legislation is always behind the technology because there's a lot of complicated aspects, privacy laws, understanding what it means. But I think by better integrating those conversations and having a better understanding of what we're setting the policies for, is really important. And I know there's a few initiatives at the University of Technology Mara that does bridge some of those conversations. I think there's a United Nations program, an USAID, I believe, partially funded fellows program as well. So there's, I know, a lot of opportunities working to help build students and help kind of bridge those in the STEM field with those in the policy field. And I think that's of critical importance as we look to long-term outcomes. The other is, as we look at in the US, what the US government is interested in investing abroad. And that goes for any country that's doing foreign investment, but specifically looking at what are the needs on the ground and better articulating with the countries that they're working to build out new projects with, new initiatives with, what do they actually need, and better articulating those needs. Because there might be a goal to help build a certain clean energy plant, but is that what that specific community needs? And I think there's room for growth, but I think also a lot of improvement in some of those conversations. I know in the US, a lot of those initiatives in the past administration, like Asia Edge, a lot of the US Trade and Development Agency projects, USAID projects, are trying to help provide some of that capital for projects that companies or governments in Asia have identified. If I'm specifically looking at US investment towards Asia. And I know there's been, in some cases, $36 million project, or in some cases $1 billion project. So there's quite a bit of financing going towards solar projects, towards trade partnerships that I think are also really important, but making sure that as that policy matters, of the policy aligns on both sides, that you're actually working towards mutual goals and not just trying to enforce one agenda in a situation where it might not be the most compatible or effective. So,
Cool. Desmond, I'm sure policy interventions are in your mind at every, as minister, every part of the day. Desmond, would you like to share some of the policy interventions from Singapore's perspective?
Sure. Thank you. And I fully agree with my colleagues here. I think other than just policy intervention, I think we recognize that one of the key challenges is about how do we change the mindset of people, right? Going forward, how do we shape? That's probably the hardest part. It's hard to do, it's hard to quantify, but that's also the most important part. So I think more than just policy, there is really a need for government around the world to communicate a compelling, burning vision of the future. And with this vision, you can then galvanize the whole of society, the whole of nation, the whole of people to move together, because actually sustainable development cannot be just done by the government itself. It cannot be done by civic society. It cannot just be done by the people. It requires all stakeholders, all parties, businesses, industries to all move along together. So that's why I think just last month, of course, Europe, they have their own New Deal. Singapore, we recently, just last month, announced the Green Plan. And that, of course, is a policy plan. It has, elements, the 5 pillars. They have a city in nature. We have energy reset, sustainable living, green economy, and resilient future. So it ranges from energy all the way to food resilience. And but what is more important, it provides a vision for our people. And we think this vision is important because we need everybody to move together. It is not a static plan. It is a 10, 20-year living plan. And we need everybody to come along to contribute, whether you're businesses or your civic group, or your individual consumer, right? We all play a part in this green plan, and we want to make sure that we all move along. So I think that to me is probably a very important aspect. And I'm glad also in ASEAN, we do see many countries moving together, and we have many forums since 2016 focusing on green as well. So I think that's the right trajectory that we're moving on. Given the current pandemic, it also provides a good opportunity for us to relook at our own plans, our own policies, our own development, and to kind of reset and provide a burning vision for our people.
Thank you, Desmond. And I think resetting is also essential during this COVID-19 period. And again, we will see whether indeed we will reset towards a more sustainable path moving forward. Okay, I will now open the floor to questions from the floor. I have a few here that have been submitted through Slido, and I'll take 3 questions first, and then we will see, cognizant of time, how many questions we can take. So question number 1, Singapore has been a model in sustainable urban planning, combining with density given the circumstances. Are cities key to sustainability by preventing sprawl? So that's the first question. I suppose that would be directed to Desmond. Second question, will green technology implementation contribute to economic growth recovery process from the pandemic? What is the comparative impact of green versus conventional energy? That's question number 2. And question number 3, I think Desmond touched on just now, but I'll ask you anyway if there's anything to add. The biggest hurdle with green initiatives is getting everyone on board. How do you appropriately incentivize to encourage more to join? Okay, I'll ask these 3 questions. Perhaps I'll begin with Desmond. You can answer any of the questions that you would like.
Okay, I'll talk about the urban planning. It is something very close to our hearts here in Singapore. Even as we are a very young nation, right? Just over 50 years old. And but even in the midst of our development, sustainability has always been very much of our DNA. Given the context that we are in, we are a very small city-state, and we have zero natural resources. So how do we develop sustainably has always been in our DNA. So even as we were building out our economy in the 1960s and 70s, actually, the government passed a Clean Air Act in 1971. That was the very beginning of our industrialization. But we realized that actually setting standards for industry, making sure that we have clean air in Singapore, and of course, we had the vision of the garden in the city and the city garden. Today, we have the city in nature. So I think these are important factors in our urban planning. And given our small space, our Urban Redevelopment Authority, or URA, actually is responsible for planning our urban city. And for a small country with 5.5 million people, actually we are quite glad that we preserve 30% of our island, a little island, on greeneries. So we have 30% of land covered by greens. That's not a bad achievement given the population that we have. And going forward, we are intending to plant another 1 million trees across the whole of Singapore, 1 million trees. That's a vision that we have set. And we're galvanizing our people to do it together, not just by the government, but our people. And also another vision, which I'm very proud and happy about, is that, if no matter where you are, where you live in Singapore, within 10 minutes, you can get to a park. That's something to me is very exciting. As somebody growing up and living in Singapore, I think that's a very important commitment that we have, and in terms of our urban planning, and requires a very long-term fruition, long-term planning and strategy, and also the commitment and the support of our people, because there's always a trade-off, as we talked about. You set aside a piece of garden, that means you lose another development, business, economy, and so on. But that's the commitment that we have, and we want to continue to plan in a way that we can grow sustainably. We still have agriculture, not as much as maybe US and China, but we set aside a piece of land in Singapore to ensure that we can actually grow our own vegetable, we can have our own eggs and even fish, and we want to redevelop and optimize these areas to master plan it. So I think the whole urban planning, as well as even not just urban, but agriculture planning, is a very important part of being able to sustain our development in Singapore.
Thank you, Desmond. And certainly Singapore is a model of sustainable cities, smart cities, and so on, is leading the way in that sense. Dr. Christoph, would you like to answer any of these 3 questions regarding, or perhaps the 2 questions regarding green technology as contributing to the process of recovery, as well as how do you incentivize everyone to get on board? Dr. Christoph?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key questions, and I'm happy that that we have such a good audience that listens and kind of cares about these topics. Everyone getting on board is, of course, extremely important and extremely difficult, and I don't think we have to necessarily get everyone on board, but we have to get more and more people on board. So before we have to say everybody has to do it at the same time. Everybody has to stop eating meat. It's really kind of the question, kind of how can we move as fast as possible, ideally leaving nobody behind, but of course, as Desmond said, kind of providing this vision. Where do we actually want to go? What is actually the kind of the better future that we're trying to create? And this is not, I wrote an article last year about Europe and kind of the European green dream. And I think that's actually kind of encompassing this exactly. It's not about making everybody fearful of the future because, oh my God, we're going to have climate change. Oh my God, we're going to have biodiversity loss. It's also not necessarily about kind of technology will save us all, because it hasn't happened. We've promised that technology will save us all for the last 100 years, and we're still talking. We're still dreaming about this technology will save us all. But it's really about creating this vision. What type of life do we actually want? What is the life that everybody or kind of many people can surround themselves with? What is the goal? And the goal is probably not that we live in cities that are crammed, but more in cities that where Desmond says that we can walk to a park. The goal is not to breathe dirty air, because finally we have so much energy that and so much coal, and we are all happy, but actually to breathe clean air, that we can go out and swim in waters. So what is the goal what is the green dream that we're pursuing, and that we can all rally around? And I think in some ways, if we go deep inside us and kind of if you look at a lot of the marketing language, we have this green dream. The question is kind of how can we get everyone on board, and how can it be beneficial to all of us? And there, in some ways, technology can help, but again, also we have to change our lifestyle. It's not that everybody has to own his or her own car. It's not about that everybody again has to eat meat every meal of the day, but where are kind of our common and shared dreams is the real question.
Thank you, Dr. Christoph. I think we are speaking along the same similar lines here, converging to a similar point in terms of really having that compelling vision, as Desmond said earlier, that everyone will join on board. Ashley, perhaps can you touch on the issue of green technology and its contribution to the green recovery, as well as the competitive impact of green conventional energy? Do you need a vision Elon Musk, as earlier mentioned by the poll?
Definitely, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for green tech as we just move forward in general. As we fit it specifically into recovery options, there's a lot of different ways it can go. One, I think that has much longer term implications that we've already been seeing is, I'm going to use Elon Musk, is electric vehicles. As we look at how do you transition industries, particularly now that we've seen massive economic disruption, particularly on the auto industry, and what that means also for oil and gas industries. What might that mean for EVs? And how do you transition from maybe a traditional combustion engine to electric vehicles? There are supply chain questions that we can talk about. How do you source these materials? What does that mean for batteries, for these technologies? That have new opportunities to build new organizations, to again build new industries that create new jobs, or retrains people from existing jobs so that they're not left behind. That's the big, I know in the US, this has been the biggest question that we deal with from a political standpoint of green versus conventional energy, of how do you ensure that some of those transitions with some of these new technologies have some kind of mechanism that brings people with them as they go. Yeah, I'll leave that there.
Thank you. We'll move on to a couple more questions. Firstly, what are your thoughts on in-fashion ideas such as degrowth and donut economics? Can they be implemented? Earlier, we spoke about the trade-offs that we always require to see it in the context of job creation, wealth creation, and so on. So, can the ideas of degrowth and donut economics be implemented? And secondly, it's a question regarding the electricity grid. A major contributor to pollution is our electricity grid. How fast can we unlink our grid from carbon, coal and gas to something clean? Should ASEAN include nuclear into the mix? So it's focusing on nuclear. Ashley, would you like to take at least one of these questions?
Sure. I'm going to jump on that very last question about nuclear and how we might balance some of the grid questions of how we transition from heavy intensive carbon fuels. I think nuclear is one of the more interesting conversations in the energy transition field, just by and large, because we know that it is one of the best sources in terms of high efficiency and zero carbon emissions. Then there is, of course, the waste question of how do you manage waste, and particularly then if you're dealing with limited land availability, where does that go? Whereas, in the US, that is always an ongoing debate with Yucca Mountain and some of the repository sites, but how do you manage that in places where it might not be quite as accessible? And I think there's a lot of really important and hopefully transformative research going on in SMRs and some of the smaller reactors that are also more resilient to external shocks like earthquakes, tsunamis, other natural disasters, which is a major concern, and rightfully so, given what we've seen at Fukushima. So I say that I think there might be a little bit more development needed in some of the nuclear space before we do scale up some of the nuclear power option in Southeast Asia. But I definitely think that is something that all countries should be considering moving forward as we look at alternatives to coal, to gas, that can meet some of the load requirements that we've benefited from in high carbon fuels. And maybe eventually we'll also get from renewable energy to that same extent. But I do think there's a lot of potential for nuclear. The other question, of course, is financing and who wants to finance nuclear, given some of those concerns that we're seeing. And I think that's another area where research and development from governments is really important right now. In the US, ARPA-E is really kind of what's driving nuclear energy development because the US private sector is not doing very well. Generally, we have to rely on international partnerships. Other countries are doing it a lot better. So I think there are opportunities for partnerships on nuclear energy development, and hopefully those will also continue to propel to get us to that stage where we can have some of those smaller reactors that are more safe for deployment. But there's definitely some lag there. So I say that it's not an immediate solution, I don't think, but definitely something that should be on an agenda moving forward. And Desmond might have some additional thoughts on nuclear, but I'll wrap it up there. You can get to some of the other questions. There's some really good content here.
Thank you, Ashley. So Desmond, I think you're off there. Do you have any thoughts on nuclear as well as?
Well, we will never rule out any options, right? Nuclear is always an option. But of course, nuclear has other considerations of safety and all that. I can't imagine nuclear as an option for Singapore in my lifetime. But you never know in future. It all depends on how technology evolves. Right now, at the current technology, I don't foresee nuclear as an energy option for us. But Singapore right now, we rely a lot on our natural gas, imported natural gas from our neighbors. So 95% of our energy, they are slightly cleaner, but I think there are still potential. We are exploring other more renewable and cleaner energy source like hydrogen. And of course, most importantly, we have already started the solar energy as well. We don't have strong winds here, unfortunately, but we have good sun. We have started putting quite a lot of solar panels on our reservoir. We have 17 reservoirs in Singapore. So rather than, we have some social activities going on in the reservoir, but we decided to dedicate some space for solar panels, huge solar panels. And the other spaces, we realized we have a lot of rooftops, right? Those are also good spaces for solar panels. So collectively, I think we are hoping to generate enough energy source using solar to power at least our own water purification and waterworks. So that's quite an energy consuming sector. and we want to see how we can use that. And finally, of course, the other options is the regional grid. Somebody talked about, I think Christoph or Ashley talked about regional grid. As ASEAN, we can collaborate in this area in terms of trading and collaboration. So that will also provide options for us as a region, as a bloc, to solve our energy issues. You know, we talk about electric vehicles just now, and that's kind of like moving from gasoline in terms of carbon emission to energy consumption, right? Actually, it doesn't really kind of eradicate the problem, but it's just transferring the carbon emission from gasoline to energy. So we still have to solve the energy problem. To me, that's the crux of sustainable development in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And technology are evolving very quickly. We are investing heavily in that sector, in that space. And you know, when the hydrogen technology, for example, comes on board, I think there's a lot of potential there for us to tap on this space. Yeah.
Okay, in Malaysia as well, the focus is on large-scale solar to affect our renewable energy transition. So not nuclear as well at this moment in time. Maybe Dr. Christoph, would you like to share some ideas in the question regarding degrowth and donut economics? Can they be implemented? I don't know if you have any views here.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the donut economics and kind of the limits of growth and kind of how we can integrate that, I think has gotten a lot of attention. I think it's a nice depiction, and I'm very happy kind of that this donut economics is growing, because I don't know how many people are aware of what donut economics is, and I'm not an expert on this, but I will do my best. And kind of the general idea is that kind of our economies and our societies depend on a number of issues, from biodiversity to climate, to the earth, to, of course, our monetary systems and de facto GDP growth. And kind of in the end, everything has its limits and needs to be integrated. So we're seeing kind of this idea being developed over actually many years. So kind of the donut economics is a continuation of kind of this idea that wealth is not only the monetary wealth, but also, of course, our natural health and whatsoever. And there are broader considerations that are being addressed right now. Kind of, we have natural capital accounting that is gaining steam as well, that allows us to capture the value of nature better and better. Again, of course, with limitations. But this idea that other things but money have value is of course important. The question of degrowth, I think it's both a very personal question, kind of how much are you willing, whoever asked the question, to do that actually, and how much as a society or kind of in kind of your closer society is willing to say we are happy with the life that we have. We don't need to grow more. And then kind of ideally it trickles up. Kind of having this from top down, a degrowth strategy, I think is extremely challenging and risky for policymakers to implement. Yeah, I think I leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Christoph. Okay, we are heading towards the last few minutes of this session. Before we end the session, I would like to ask each panelist, by way of wrapping up and reflecting on the whole session. After we heard from each other as well as from the various questions from the audience, I would like to ask each panelist, should ASEAN countries pursue their own Green New Deal? If so, how will that look like? Please provide your answers in about 3 minutes or so, and provide any concluding thoughts. Maybe I'll start with Ashley.
All right, I will keep it brief. By and large, I think yes. I think really every country should have some kind of Green New Deal plan as we look at what do we value in terms of where we're going. I know this was something that Christoph hit on earlier, of what are our goals that we want to get to and how do you get there? And I think a Green New Deal plan, it doesn't have to be the same, and it shouldn't be the same across every country. And it needs to be realistic, but it also should be ambitious. What is that target? Because there is a lot of heavy lifting that we have to do based on personal consumption questions, but also that policy. How do we reshape policy that might have been entrenched for decades? And that is a radical change in many cases. But I think at the heart of it, there is a goal to get to a sustainable world where we don't have to worry about air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, that people are being able to pick up new skill sets as they grow, as the economy grows in whatever capacity that it might be. So I think there's value in that.
Thank you. Dr. Christoph?
So I couldn't agree more. I think it's a huge opportunity for ASEAN countries to pursue their own Green Deal. This is one of the most dynamic regions, if not the most dynamic region in the world. Extremely young and well-educated people, a very integrated economy, and in many ways it kind of has been working together. As Desmond said, there are all these forums available that allow for common policy making. So I think it's a huge opportunity to really think, how can ASEAN kind of revive their economies into a much greener direction? ASEAN has been a little bit the laggard, also because of continued investments, again, in non-green energy systems. I think there really can be a push. It's a huge opportunity. And since you asked kind of about the last points that I want to give everyone, I really want to encourage everyone kind of, for greener sake, actually, to live healthier. There are 3 points. Walk and bike. It gives you a much better feeling. You don't sit in the car. Walk and bike. Second, eat healthier with more vegetables and fruit and nuts, so less meat. It gives you it's healthier for the body. And become more mindful in your consumption. Do a circular economy. Buy less. It's kind of your contribution, not only through a green deal on the ASEAN level, but also what you can do as an individual.
Thank you, Dr. Christoph, also for those wise words of advice. Minister, Mr. Desmond, you have the final word.
Oh, thank you. So I really enjoy what I've heard, and thanks. I learned so much through Ashley and Christoph as well, and of course, Alizan, through your facilitation. I just want to say that I'm very confident about the National Green Deal for all ASEAN countries. We have already started. We talk about Singapore, Malaysia have a green technology plan, Indonesia, Thailand. I think respective country has already started. To me, it's about how the region can come together to collaborate and work together, because we know we are stronger as a bloc. We constitute about 9% of the world population. Our GDP has grown 100-fold since 1967 when the bloc was formed. But I foresee that we will probably not have a Green Deal, ASEAN Green Deal like the EU has, but we will have national green plans, and as a region, we will sort of set a goal, a common goal, and a direction that we all can move together. And I'm very confident that we will collaborate in many of the areas we talk about, whether it's energy, technology, education, businesses, and green financing, and so on. I think this is where, as an ASEAN bloc, I'm confident that we will move together. But it requires a political will, the continued collaboration, and of course, not just at the top, at the bottom, our people have to step up. There are a lot of bottom-up initiatives, and I'm quietly confident that we will move in the right direction. So on that positive note, I just want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to encourage everybody to live well, to, like Christoph said, eat more vegetables, and stay active and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Desmond, and also thank you for concluding on a positive note. I think in this session, I won't summarize everything, but we started with describing some of the challenges that we are facing, and when it comes to sustainable development, climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, etc. It can be quite daunting, I think, these challenges. But as the session went on, I think we have also spoken about some of the solutions, whether they be technological, finance, policy solutions, and so on. But I think what is clear is we need to build some sort of momentum to change the mindsets, to change the narrative, and to really change and transform towards sustainability. So, well, there's still major challenges ahead, major trade-offs, etc., that we discuss. I think what is clear is that there is some momentum, there is a movement towards sustainability, and perhaps there is no choice really in some ways, that we need to move towards sustainability. So I think from this session, I think it's good that we ended on this positive note. I think there are movements towards it. So it's not a question of perhaps if, it's perhaps a question of when we really transform towards sustainable development. Okay, with that, I conclude this panel by thanking once again our esteemed panelists for such an enlightening session. And I thank you all as well for joining us this morning and providing the compelling questions. So stay safe, live healthy, and have a great weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.